Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AAC's webinar. Today, our session is Weathering the Supply Chain Storm. Our presenter is Tej Patel. Tej has over 15 years of consulting and industry experience specializing in the areas of supply chain, operation improvements, and manufacturing. Prior to joining Techivan, he was the vice president at Alex Partners, a leading global consulting firm. As part of the supply chain and operations practice, he led a number of cost-saving and efficiency incentives among a variety of manufacturers. Additionally, Tej has held positions at Baxter, a Fortune 150 medical manufacturer, and Arcstone Consulting. While at Arcstone Consulting, he led multiple client teams and projects in the areas of floor plant operations, lean manufacturing, and supply chain improvements across several industries. Tej holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management, with concentrations in operations, strategy, and marketing, in addition to a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering from Northwestern University. Tej sits on several AAC committees and is a member of the board of directors. Today is a pre-recorded webinar. All computer audio and telephone lines are muted, so if you have questions during the webinar, please email us at mail@anodazine.org. And now, I'm pleased to turn the webinar over to Tej.
Thanks, Dave. Hey, everyone. This is Tej Patel. I'm here to be giving everyone the Weathering the Supply Chain Storm webinar. So depending on what part of the world you're in, I'm in Chicago. It's about 10 o'clock, so good morning. It's a Friday, so looking forward to the weekend. The hope of the webinar here is to kind of encapsulate what we as a supply chain and industry have experienced since the pandemic in 2020. So some of this information is a little dated, but I still think we're all feeling a little bit of that crunch of the supply chain even now in 2023. So let me hop right into it. So the overview for today's webinar, we're going to kind of go through the overall supply chain, discuss factors that contribute to the supply chain disruptions, material input and output cost overview. So that's essentially trying to understand, hey, what are the real driving cost factors that are contributing to rising prices, right? Inflation, something that's always an issue. This kind of touches on that. Some potential techniques and methods to mitigate supply chain challenges. And then I'll try to wrap up with some conclusions and key takeaways. All right, so setting the stage. So since March of 2020, when the COVID pandemic began, the global supply chain was kind of thrown into an absolute train wreck. Demand kind of went from the service sector to more hard goods that resulted in increased lumber, meat, toilet paper, you name it. Tangible goods increased in price and services dropped because people weren't flying, people weren't going on vacations. And that really pushed the supply chain into a tailspin. Certain products, at least initially, were spared those price fluctuations. Oil is a great example because people didn't drive to work anymore. So it was a very weird time, and it created a lot of pressure in different spots of our supply chain. Then in 2022, when vaccines and treatment methods were established, people decided that they were locked up in their homes for 2 years and they wanted to spend money on different things. And that surge in demand further exacerbated an overall problem that still existed when COVID started. Now, as it relates to the anodizing industry, originally with a lot of offshoring to China and Asia, certain industry sectors actually have increased their demand of late and post-COVID. Aerospace, automotive, luxury consumer goods, all of that demand is increasing. And with challenges around global supply chains and even what had happened in China with regards to their lockdowns, domestic demand has increased and domestic supply is trying to catch up. So there are a few still fundamental issues that we're going to kind of touch on, domestic and international material production, right? So originally individual places where you could buy raw materials and get them to the US pretty quick, that whole dynamic has changed. Logistics, staffing, and planning. So how are you going to manage a global supply chain when certain countries are totally shut down and there's no capacity to ship stuff? Labor staffing. So now with people retiring early, women exiting the workforce, how do you get individuals to staff a organization to fulfill orders and meet customer demand? Obviously, a myriad of unforeseen environmental environmental issues. We've had all types of, droughts, heavy rains, hurricanes. I mean, there's all kinds of things that further put pressure on this. Geopolitical instability, Ukraine, China, tensions are high across the world in a lot of different areas that used to not have as much friction. Consumer demand, unfortunately or fortunately, hasn't really changed. There's still a high demand there, at least in the US especially, for a lot of the items and services that we couldn't experience for 2 years. And then finally, unfortunately, there are just bad operators. There are companies out there that saw rising prices an opportunity for them to make a lot of money, and that's what they did. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of some of what we're experiencing here with the supply chain. All right. So I touched on this a little bit, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. So this table kind of outlines the overall supply chain issue and some examples of what we've seen. So logistics scheduling and capacity, right? So this discusses the overall global logistics situation, right? There's a cargo ship that was stuck in the Suez that drove lead times up. Cargo ship captain contracts have been expiring, and those areas aren't being filled. Again, labor's linked to that. There was a global container shortage, port congestion, and port congestion is further exacerbated by not having people to staff the port. So that's just one example. But as I go through this list, just be aware that each one of these things compounds on the other, and it makes it worse. So these are these things that add up, and they don't add up. 1 + 1 doesn't necessarily mean 2. It could be 1 + 1 could equal 3 or 5 in these cases. So on the labor staffing situation, obviously vaccine mandates have created challenges with the workforce. Illnesses that some people are sick, they choose not to come in. It's a very different dynamic now. There are few women in the workforce because of childcare shortages, and then there's labor strikes. So the labor market is up and down, and it's very difficult. Unforeseen environmental issues, right? We hinted on this earlier: wildfires, winter storms. There was severe flooding in Europe, energy shortages in Texas. It's been a systemic issue, and now compound these unforeseen environmental issues on existing problems, you start seeing the cracks. Geopolitical instability. Chinese tariffs have driven prices up. China has been on lockdown, or was on lockdown, for many portions of 2020, 2021, and even 2022. Now that's loosening up, but what do we have to deal with now? A conflict in Ukraine, right? So you have one of the largest oil exporters in Russia engaging in a military conflict with one of the largest grain exporters in Ukraine. So all of this stuff further exacerbates everything. Consumer demand variation. So this was more probably in the early parts of the pandemic, but you had increased demand in certain products, right? Hand sanitizer, toilet paper, meat, milk, and increased demand for outdoor products because during COVID lockdowns, people wanted to spend time outside. So side-by-sides, camping gear, etc. And then finally, like I mentioned before, bad operators. You have oil company price gouging, foodstuff price gouging, and most recently with the recent pharmaceutical issues you've had on albuterol and insulin, and even baby formula. That's all been issues here where there is some suspicion around price gouging. All right, now that's the high macro level. What does that mean for us in the specific anodizing industry? So this table kind of breaks down, if you're an anodizer or you're purchasing anodizing, what are the kind of factors that you need to be aware of? First, critical chemistry components, right? So these are some of the basic chemistries that play a role in anodizing: sulfuric acid, acetic acid, caustic, stannous sulfate, and nickel salts. All of those products are sourced globally and require fairly labor-intensive extraction methods. Compound that with putting them on containers and shipping them internationally, it becomes even more difficult. So as I'm sure many people have experienced since 2020 up until now, 2023, there were shortages of sulfuric acid. You had acetic acid shortages, caustic. Metal prices were through the roof. That's further compounded by conflicts in Ukraine and Russia. So all of those things interplay with this, and that's the primary focal point on the chemistry components. That doesn't even include some of the other anodizing dyes, which are specialty chemicals that further see some of this. On the packaging side, pallets, drums, and totes. It seems pretty basic, but there were pallet shortages, drum shortages, and tote shortages. Maybe not necessarily from a raw material perspective, but from having an inability to staff the manufacturing or the delivery of those items. Freight, and this is where staffing plays a big role. Reduced capacity of hazmat drivers due to COVID. Reduced capacity of bulk containers. So you want to ship a tanker of a product, there's not that many truck drivers doing it anymore. Reduced capacity of shipping containers. Couple that with port congestion. So as I mentioned before, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 in this case. 1 + 1 could equal 3 or 5 in terms of the stress level that it puts in the supply chain. And then critical metals, right? Aluminum quality deterioration, because now sourcing aluminum from China and some of these other places with tariffs has gone up and more difficult. Titanium for titanium tooling can be difficult to find. And then certain aluminum alloys are difficult to find. So this is kind of, as an anodizer or as a purchaser of anodizing, these are the variables and the metrics that you're kind of juggling. All right. So I know there's a lot going on this page, but what I tried to do here was kind of explain what the basic material input costs are and output costs. So if you look at the far left, if you're an anodizer, you have essentially 4 fundamental components to your cost: the labor, the raw material, the inbound freight for that raw material, and then your indirect costs: packaging, marketing expenses, miscellaneous other expenses, etc. So those 4 things add up to the cost of your chemical. Now, if you look at what's in the dotted line box, that is the summation of the cost to the final anodizer. So if I'm a chemistry supplier, I have that cost of my product, I tack on the outbound freight, and then obviously I tack on supplier profit. Now that is the total summation of what the anodizer will purchase. So if you'll notice some similarities here, you'll see freight as a big portion of it. That's a big cost. Labor issues can trickle into this too. So when you're looking at this whole picture, you have to understand it's all connected, and it only gets more difficult and more expensive as we continue to move down the supply chain. So the individual components all have multiple layers of cost, and they further drive the prices up. So as I mentioned, labor availability, raw material availability, inventory holding costs, because again, if you try to get ahead of this and you want to raise your inventory levels, there's a cost to that. And the inventory that you made at the beginning of the year may be different than the inventory you have at the end of the year. And then finally, the freight lead time and brokerage fees. So the intent here is to kind of just show you from a visual perspective how many possible places could go wrong that drive up price. And as you can see, based on what I've outlined before, it's pretty much every one of these metrics have seen some disruption. All right. So we talked about all the problems, right? Let's discuss some of the ways to potentially manage it or mitigate some of the challenges that we see. So this slide discusses labor costs. Now, everyone doesn't necessarily have the same labor situation, but the intent here was to provide guidance on what are some things you can do as an anodizer, as a chemical supplier, or even as a purchaser of anodizing to help manage that overall supply chain. So shift management, and a lot of companies do this. Staggering shifts, right? Limiting overtime and burnout, increasing training and workload planning. So what has happened now is with people leaving the workforce, certain employees have stayed. In many cases, those employees have been at those companies for a longer period of time, and they're now required to do more work because we have lower levels of staff, but higher or equivalent demand. And what happens to those workers? They get burned out. So the intent here is to manage the workload for them to ensure you have a sustainable workforce that you can manage and that you don't overwork. The next, employee relationship management. So this is part of engaging with your employees in your company. I'm part of a family business. This is something we do a lot of. We work with our employees. We have employee appreciation. We set up meetings with them to understand what their challenges are, what we can do. And it's that fostering of that relationship and acknowledging high performance employees that allows us to work together and realize that, you know what, you are working the best you can. And unfortunately, instead of the normal 2 orders a day that we have to fulfill, now we have 15 orders to fulfill. That's not the employee's fault. That's a demand issue, and you have to manage that. Employee benefits. So the first thing that you can do as a company is assess your employee benefits, ensure that they're competitive, because the key here is you want to retain the employees that you know are good, and the workforce to ensure that they have a home at your company, right? So childcare is a significant challenge here. Having flexibility around work schedules and letting individuals spend time with their family and deal with family commitments as needed is a very important factor there, right? Emphasizing a work-life balance, because the key here is all an effort to establish a good employee-employer relationship. Health and safety, and this was probably a bigger issue earlier during the pandemic, 2020, 2021, COVID-19 testing and sickness policy, right? There are various opinions around COVID and sickness policies. The challenge with that is managing all those opinions in a workforce can be difficult, right? So the intent here is, as you foster that employee relationship, understand, hey, maybe certain employees have pre-existing conditions or are really scared about getting sick. And for that, you need to be accommodating and help them. So being aware and fostering that relationship with the employee is absolutely critical. And I think that'll facilitate not only a good relationship, but also allow you to staff and manage costs. So the next one here, methods to mitigate supply chain disruptions. This is all about raw materials, right? So the 3 areas of focus. The first one, accurate usage estimates. So what you need to do as a supplier or even as an anodizer is understand what your monthly and quarterly usage is, not what it was 2 or 3 years ago, but what it is currently. Historicals have been kind of inaccurate as demand has skyrocketed. So the key here is to understand what real demand is and what you're seeing now, not what you saw 5 years ago, right? So that's absolutely critical, is making sure you have a realistic usage amount on what you're using and what your raw materials need to be. Inventory management, knowing that there are long lead times, knowing that prices are going up from order to order. If you have the ability to invest in stock and store raw materials, it is a huge asset. Obviously, there's a financial burden to that because you're spending money in the hopes that you will sell that product, but it's something to consider. The more inventory you carry, the more flexibility you have to engage in the market and also provide a sustainable and reliable supplier to the industry. Efficient order patterns. So this is one that I try to work with my customers on, and even with my suppliers too, is understanding, is there a repetitive order frequency, and is there a repetitive order amount that we can come up with so our customers and our anodizers can work together to understand, hey, look, every month, every 2 months, I'm going to be placing this order. This is my typical demand. It allows us as a supplier to the industry to manage our inventory and helps our usage estimates. And it allows us to move down the supply chain and create some reliable inventory management and order fulfillment. All right, freight costs. Again, I'm trying to go at this at each par point. So we did labor costs, we did raw material costs, and now freight costs. There's a lot of levers you can turn here. The first is negotiated freight rates, right? So depending on where you're shipping to, there are national carriers and local carriers. If you have a very large national presence, perhaps negotiating with a national carrier makes sense. If you're more regional based, then identifying a local freight carrier can make a lot of sense. But that's something that you should look into now, because there could be opportunity there to really save on both inbound freight and also outbound freight to your customer. Maximum order quantity. So I kind of hinted on this before. If you're shipping a pallet to a customer, it is in everyone's interest to fill that pallet up. Instead of putting 1 drum or 5 pails on that pallet, try to maximize all the space on that pallet to ensure you are getting the lowest possible freight cost there is. Lead time management. So this goes to trying to avoid expediting shipping. That is the most painful way of getting a product because you're paying a lot for it. It's a high stress situation. Production lines could be paused. So it's really important to manage lead time so you can communicate downstream of the supply chain to your supplier, and then your supplier can communicate to their raw material vendors. So it's really important that when you look at your supply chain and you look at what your order frequency is and your usage, you set up a realistic lead time. And this goes back to freight shipping methods now. So there are a multitude of ways to ship, right? Sea freight, air freight. If you're selling internationally, sea freight's obviously more economical. Air freight's more expensive. So understanding lead time management, you could potentially save a significant amount of money by leveraging sea freight over air freight. And then finally, packaging method, right? So work with your freight carriers to see if there's opportunities to rationalize your packaging. So can you double stack pallets? Is there certain creative designs on how you're packing things to allow a freight carrier to optimize what they put in their tractor trailer so your freight costs go down? Indirect costs. And this one's primarily focused around packaging materials, right? So the first piece of it is, can you identify lower cost packaging items, right? Thin wall, recycled products. Can you do some things here to potentially remove inserts or use different types of inserts to make the overall net cost of your packaging lower? Can you use reusable items, return and reuse? So in the case of drums, totes, or bins, could those be hauled back? And is it cost effective to haul them back? But there's a benefit there. There's no disposal cost, and we're able to save money on packaging as it relates to the chemistry. All right, so kind of summing all this up, these are two perspectives here. One, my advice to suppliers to the industry, and my advice to customers. As a supplier, you need to be honest and upfront with your customers regarding the situation that you're in. Be upfront. There's no sense in deceiving them. As I see it, being open and honest about your relationship with your customer is the best way to go. Manage your existing finished goods and raw material supply aggressively to ensure your existing customers are maintained. I know it's a lot of opportunities to grow your business in situations like this, but be careful. The chance you take to grow your business could jeopardize your existing customers who've been with you for a long time. And then as part of this whole dialogue, set up regular contact points with your critical customers. You want to be attached to the hip with them to make sure that they have an open line of communication and you're all on the same page. Customer advice now. So it kind of goes the same way. Work with your suppliers in good faith. Try to reduce, avoid trying to reduce your potential supplier base by hammering them on price and creating a sustainable supply chain. Work with them in good faith, and you will be treated as a valued customer. Develop accurate and internal demand forecasts. So as any supplier reaches out to their customer, as a customer, do your due diligence and provide them with realistic numbers and demand so they can service you and provide you with the goods you need. If you can't do that, that creates friction, right? If you put an order in 1 month for 1 pound of something, but then the next month you put an order in for 10,000 pounds of something, it becomes difficult for a supplier to meet your requirements. Try to have visibility as best you can. And then identify suppliers that are willing to work creatively to manage supply disruption. So does that mean doing consignment? Does that mean they are willing to perhaps just develop some R&D and some processes to reduce your consumption, to overall innovate the process, right? So try to identify those creative suppliers who are more nimble in situations like these. Excuse me. And kind of to summarize all of that, as the global economy continues to deal with this, things are going to work their way through it, and it's still going to be a challenging situation. I mean, the conflicts we're seeing right now and the situations we're seeing globally don't seem to be going anywhere. It doesn't seem like it's going to wrap itself up in a nice bow. So moving forward, suppliers, anodizers, and anodizing end users must all assess their individual supply chain and identify opportunities to manage that risk. So some of these approaches I've seen include reshoring critical materials and services back to North America or locally, right? By having them locally now, you have some assurances that you have supply that can meet the demand. Increasing investment in domestic capacity, right? So investing in whatever you need to ensure that your supply chain is reliable and perhaps arm's length away. Managing freight costs. Work with your freight suppliers. Identify a approach and a strategy to rationalize your network and see if there's ways to reduce cost. And then provide guidance and accurate demand projections. That's all about managing inventory and working with your customers. Now, more than ever, customers and supplier relationships are going to be stressed, and it's really critical to operate in good faith and work with each other. I understand it's stressful, and I'm sure it's difficult, but we have to kind of realize that these are very, very different times right now, and working together is going to provide you with a much more benefit than working in conflict. So as anodizing capacity continues to adjust to the increasing demand, customers must be willing to make the appropriate investments to ensure their supply chains are sustainable. So that means it's going to require some roll up your sleeves work to manage some of this and look at your businesses in an effort to weather the storm, to be honest. That wraps it up. this is some information, questions. We'll obviously have a question session later on. But again, my name is Tej Patel. I work for Tekivon. We're a global supplier of anodizing chemistry. Happy to give the presentation out. Hopefully everyone found it helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tej, for a terrific presentation. A copy of this presentation will be available on the AAC website Members Only section. If you'd like to present an AAC webinar in 2023, please contact us at mail@anodizing.org. The evaluation survey for this webinar will be sent to you shortly. Please share your comments with us. Your input is very valuable and helpful in developing future webinars. Thank you again for being with us today.